What's up everybody, this is Mike Henderson, also known as Endo. I am a DJ product specialist for Native Instruments and an instructor at DubSpot. I'm also the tour manager for Dubfire, Pete Tong, Sharam, and Nicole Mudaber. Now throughout my years working for Native Instruments, I've trained all sorts of artists on Traktor. Artists like Danny Tenaglia, Grandmaster Flash, Sasha, Carl Cox, Diplo, and tons more. And while working with these artists, I've done custom MIDI mappings for them. And now you guys can download them and use them for yourselves. In this video, I'm going to show you guys my all-new 4-deck mapping for the Traktor Kontrol F1. With this mapping, you can actually control everything inside of Traktor, controlling all 4 decks. And the mapping also has a 4-channel built-in mixer, so you have 4 volume faders and 4 filters to control Traktor's built-in mixer. On top of using my deck mapping, you can actually switch back and forth between using the deck mapping and also controlling the remix decks in Traktor, so it has 2 functions. Now just a little history of how I made this mapping. I was actually tour managing for Sharam at Warung in Brazil, and we went to an after party and there was no mixer or speakers and they wanted me to DJ. So I realized I had this F1 controller with me, and you can see I have 4 volume faders, so I figure why not just map this as a 4-deck mixer. And then I continued to make the rest of the mapping live on the fly and ended up playing for 10 hours with this controller. After that weekend, I went over to David Morales' for a Traktor training and I told him about my mapping, and he told me that he wanted to use it live. So I actually ended up staying up all night at David's studio, programming the controller and programming all the LED outputs and everything, so David could leave the next day to Europe and use it on tour. So you can be sure that every button and every knob in this mapping was double checked and works perfectly. So my last mapping tutorial video was on my machine mapping for Traktor, which turned your machine controller into a powerful 4-deck controller for Traktor, and you can download that on my site. For those of you who are using my machine mapping, you're going to love this mapping because everything's basically laid out the same with all the pads, except now it has a built-in 4-channel mixer on it. You can buy my mapping by going to djendo.com and then click on the Mappings tab. After you've bought the mapping, PayPal will automatically send you a link to download the mapping. Now if you don't see the email right away, check your junk mail folder, because a lot of the time these emails get sent to the spam folder. When you've downloaded the mapping, you'll see in the folder I have a setup guide, as well as the F1 deck mapping.tsi, this is the Traktor file that you're going to load, as well as the F1 deck mapping.nckf1, that's the controller editor file, and there's also a folder that has some images that show exactly what each button does. Now before loading the mappings, you're going to want to make sure you're on the latest version of Traktor Pro and also the controller editor. You can update both of these programs by going to the Service Center under Applications, Native Instruments, Service Center, and clicking on the Updates tab. You can also get the updates at the Native Instruments website by going to this link and clicking on Support, Updates, and Downloads. Now let's load up the mapping. Before you open Traktor, you're going to open up the Controller Editor application under Applications, Native Instruments, Controller Editor. Once you're in the Controller Editor, you're going to click on the Device drop-down menu in the upper left-hand side of the screen, and you're going to select Traktor, Traktor Kontrol F1, Traktor Kontrol F1 1. And then you're going to select the Templates tab and choose Edit, Open, and load the file f1deckmapping.nckf1. Once you've loaded that file, your screen should look like this. You're going to notice that every button, every knob, and every fader is labeled. Now you're going to open Traktor. With Traktor open, you're going to click on the Preferences icon, which is the gear icon in the upper right-hand side of the screen, and then click on Traktor Kontrol F1. This next step is really important. When you're in the Traktor Kontrol F1 Preferences pane, you're going to go to where it says MIDI mode, and you're going to change the MIDI mode type to MIDI mode. Now, if you don't see the Traktor Kontrol F1 Preferences pane in the Preferences, you're going to need to add a mapping to the Controller Manager in order for the Traktor Kontrol F1 preferences to show up. Here's a little trick. You just click on Add, Traktor, Kontrol F1, Default. Now the Traktor Kontrol F1 preferences should show up on the left-hand side of the preferences screen. Another thing that you want to check is you want to make sure that there's not a Traktor Kontrol F1 user map loaded. So to do this, you're going to click on the device drop-down menu inside of the controller manager, and then just look through your list and make sure there isn't any devices called Traktor Kontrol F1 user. The one that you do want loaded is the Traktor Kontrol F1 default one. If you do have a Traktor Kontrol F1 user mapping loaded, just select that in the device drop-down menu, then click on Edit, Delete, and that will delete the user mapping. Now we're going to load up the Endo mapping. To load my settings, you're going to want to make sure you're still under Preferences, Controller Manager, and under the device drop-down menu, you're going to click the Add button and then choose Import. Then you're going to navigate to the folder where you bought the settings and choose f1deckmapping.tsi. Now you can plug in your F1 controller. Just plug a USB cable from the controller into the computer, and once the controller turns on, you're going to hold Shift and push the Browse button. While the Shift button is held down, push the Browse button, and that will put the controller into MIDI mode. When using this mapping, you always want to be in MIDI mode. If you want to switch back to controlling the remix decks, just hold Shift and push Browse to go back into remix deck mode. Now before you start playing with the controller, there's a couple more things I want you to check first. Make sure the controller is in MIDI mode by doing Shift Browse, and then what you're going to do is you're going to go through each device in the controller manager, and you're going to make sure that the in port and the out port are set correctly. This is so your MIDI mappings don't interfere with each other and read from each other. So what you're going to do is you're going to go to the device drop-down menu, click it, and look at all the mappings you have loaded. Now you're going to click on each individual mapping, and for the in port, you're going to choose the in port for that controller. For the F1 mapping, you're going to want to go to the F1 deck mapping device, and for the in port, you're going to set it to Traktor Kontrol F1, and for the out port, you're going to set it to Traktor Kontrol F1. So now Traktor is getting MIDI from the controller, and it's also sending LED output to the controller, so you're going to get lots of pretty colors. So let's take a look at the controller. So up at the top of the controller, you can see that we have 4 volume faders and 4 filters. You can use that to control the volume faders and filters in Traktor's internal mixer. At the bottom of the controller, we have these 4 small narrow pads. These are my deck selector buttons, so I can select what deck I'm loading or controlling just by pushing one of these 4 buttons. Once I push one of the deck selector buttons, the 16 pads above that will correspond to that deck. We also have this middle section here that has sync, quantize, capture that each do their own thing. So to browse through my tracks, what I'm going to do is turn the browse knob. So when I turn the browse knob, you'll see that Traktor scrolls up and down through my tracks. If I want to scroll through my playlists, I can hold the Shift button and then turn the browse knob, and that'll scroll through my playlist. And you'll notice how when I'm turning the browse knob, that the decks actually collapse to give me more room on my screen to see the tracks. When I load the tracks into the deck will become what's called the focus deck. The deck letter will turn orange, so you can see that that deck is the focus deck. All the other headphone buttons for the other decks turn off, so that'll let me pre-listen to the deck in my headphones. So when I've loaded into a deck, that deck becomes the focus, and then the 16 pads above the deck selectors will correspond to that deck only. So to play a track, I can push the top left button in the main pad section, and that will play or pause the track. Now before I hit play on track B, I'm going to turn the sync button on. The sync button is the upper right button in the main pad section. The sync button turns orange if it's on. And then I hit play. Now if the mix is a little off, I can use the pitch bend buttons to correct the mix. You notice how when I push the pitch bend buttons, that the buttons become pink, signifying that I'm pushing them, and the phase meter is going to move to the left and to the right. So if the phase meter is in the center, that means my mix is dead on, but sometimes the beat grid's a little bit off, so you're going to need to use these pitch bends to correct the mix. Now the second row of pads is for looping. I can use the first button on the second row to turn the loop on or off, and you'll notice that while the deck's looping, that all 4 of the lights in the second row will turn green. And I can use the second and third buttons in this row to make the loop size bigger or smaller. And then the fourth button on this row is the active button, which will activate stored loops or will turn on or off a loop while the track is looping. Now the third row of pads is my hotcues section. I can trigger 4 hotcues in this row. So the first pad is hotcue 1, the second pad is hotcue 2, the third pad is hotcue 3, and the fourth pad is hotcue 4. Now the cool thing about these buttons is these are magic hotcue buttons. They do 3 things at once when you push them. So for example, if I push hotcue 1, it's going to jump to the first hotcue in the track, it's going to turn play on, and it's going to turn sync on. This is what's called a macro, something that does 3 things with 1 push of a button. So on the bottom row, you got 4 more buttons. So the first button on the bottom row is what's called flux mode. Flux mode will let me trigger cue points and trigger loops without losing the phrasing of my track. It's a timeline-based transport technique that lets you interact with Traktor's transport controls. It's like a second playhead is playing underneath, and you can jump to cue points and set crazy loops or backspin. And as soon as you stop looping or let go of the cue point, it'll jump right back to the position it would be as if it were continuing to play. Now the next 2 buttons are my favorite 2 buttons in this whole mapping. So the middle 2 buttons on the bottom row are beat jump buttons. What beat jump lets me do is it lets me jump 32 beats forward or backwards in my track. So the whole concept behind this mapping is you hit the magic cue points to drop on the 1, sync and everything, and then you use the beat jump buttons to jump seamlessly through the track, and then you can use your loop functions and everything else to remix your tracks live. The last button in the main pad section is the reset button. When I push this button, it will jump to the beginning of my track. Now on the middle section of the controller, we have some buttons like sync, quantize, capture, reverse, type, size, and browse. So the sync button will turn on the sync button for whatever deck that I have selected. The capture button will turn on snap mode in Traktor. Snap mode is great for setting loops in Traktor because it will snap your loop to the nearest beat marker in the deck. It's also really good for setting cue points because when you set a cue point, it will snap your cue point to the nearest beat marker. The reverse and type buttons will actually speed up or slow down the track. If I push the reverse and type buttons, you notice that the track slowly gets faster or slower. If I want to move the tempo faster, I can hold shift and push the reverse and type buttons and it'll move faster up or down. The size button will turn on the filter for whatever deck you have selected. If I push the quantize button on the F1, it'll turn quantize mode in Traktor on or off. What this means is when I trigger a hot cue, Traktor will wait for the next downbeat in the song before jumping to that cue point. So if you have multiple tracks running in sync, you can trigger cue points in any of the decks without the tracks going off beat. So I always leave the quantize on. But if you want to trigger the cue points drumming style on the off beats, you can turn the quantize off. So now let's talk about the top of the controller. As I mentioned, at the top of the controller we have our mixer section. So we have a volume fader for each deck, and then right above it is the filter for that deck. Remember, you have to push the size button to turn the filter on. If you don't see the mixer in Traktor, you can either switch to a layout that has the mixer on it, such as the mixer layout, or you can go to Preferences Mixer and turn on the option for Filter, Cue, Gain, Key, Balance. And this will enable the mixer in the layout that you're using. Now for those of you who want to change the colors on the mapping, you can actually do that by going to the Controller Editor application. It's under Applications, Native Instruments, Controller Editor. And you can just double click on any of the buttons that you want to change, and then you'll see on the lower right hand side of the screen, you can change the color for the on and off state for that button. Now some other little features that I have mapped out, if you hold shift, you can actually delete your cue points. So if I'm in shift mode, I can delete the cue points just by pushing the cue point I want to delete. Also, if I want to beat jump by 1 beat, I can hold shift and push the beat jump buttons, and that will jump forwards or backwards by 1 beat. Also in shift mode, I have these flux mode macros. So if I hold shift and push any of the buttons on the top 2 rows, it will set a loop and turn flux mode. And when I release it, it turns flux mode off. So you can do some really cool loop rolls in this section. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. For more info about me, check out djendo.com. Also, be sure to check out my online digital DJing with Traktor course with DJ Shifty at dubspot.com. Peace.